Hi everyone, welcome. This is a presentation on a paper called Sociology of Sport Organizations, a General Perspective, Limits, and Views in France, and the author of the paper is Denis Bernardou-Moreau. In France, the sociology of sport organizations has existed since 1980s. It is a new field that when you compare it to other sports sociology branches that were created like in 1911 or in 1965, originally in the 1960s, there was some momentum when there were some individualized and fragmented research topics that started to take off. And then in the following years, quantitative data on French practices grew considerably. And then in the 1980s, the studies looked at sequences of interest and demographic dysfunction in sport organizations. At the end of the 1990s, work on professionalization in sport appeared with a focus on sociology as well as management. At the start of the 2000s, sociology for sport organizations was established as a field that combine sociological, historic, economic, administrative, and managerial approaches, as well as federal, non-profit, public, and private organizations. Sport sociology continues to struggle to delineate its scientific field boundaries. The 1980s marked the starting point from two different sources, management and sociology. From a managerial standpoint, it was a question of defining sport management and designing the content of the field and the skill sets that were necessary for this field. And then from a sociological perspective, it was a question of classifying federations as places that were suitable for collective action rather than structures. The sociology of sport organizations then developed into three axes. First, interest groups mindful of power relations and transformations in organization types between employees and volunteers. Second, power redistribution to a more political approach favoring governance and political strategies to stabilize the new set of social relationships. And finally, from a macro-social and evolutionist angle, organizational configurations ended up with contingency theories, modeling life cycles to adjust to changing environments. Federations are flexible, and the strategies developed by different groups sometimes oppose groups with different interests. Professionalization changes the internal power dynamics between volunteers and employees, or amateurs and professionals. There are three types of organizational cultures. Voluntary culture of elected parties based on a federal mindset. Culture of public service of operating frameworks provided by the states. Managerial culture of performance and profitability by managers and experts. Power gets monopolized by leading social groups that invest in management positions that take actions and impose values and meanings that conform to ethos of orders. So we see this confrontation of two cultures. On the one side, the amateur culture is based on selflessness, and then on the other side, the managerial one is favoring performance and professionalization. A more professional type of volunteering is modifying the forms of sociability in sports. And then there is this fundamental paradox between organizations' demands for rationalization and the need to preserve identity. The professionalization of associations has organizational and structural consequences, but it does not erase the original identity of giving and selflessness of volunteers. But volunteer work is put under stress. However, it remains the cornerstone of nonprofits. Sometimes in crisis situations, managers try to compromise with their employees based on commercial public service principles. This common good makes it possible to unify the private and public sector in some organizations. Power plays and territory challenges cause conflicts in social groups with different cultures, strategies, and interests, and the research indicates employees and professionals are taking power from volunteers and amateurs. Typologies are frames of reference that present a simplified interpretation of organized forms of social and political structures by setting out their commonalities and differences. There are multiple examples that are given in the paper, but for the sake of brevity, we're only going to use one example in this slideshow. Let's talk about the president of a federation. He or she is going to reveal strategies of establishment. Research revealed 4 models of governance in sport. First, the strong presidential type, where we see the president has significant decision-making power and influence. Second, the joint presidential type, where we see the president and the national director sharing power. Third, the split presidential type. Here's where the president and a team of paid directors share and coordinate tasks. And finally, the managerial presidential type, where the core is dominated by administrative or technical directors. Contingency theories emerged in the 1970s, and they suggest that the evolution of organizations depends on the influence of environmental variables. Research in French sport organizations shows bureaucratic and professional hybridizations, and organizations can make these changes in response to professionalization as a goal. The strategic apex is made up from club presidents and pay managers whose expertise and knowledge is appreciated based on result. Then the middle line links the apex and the base and is made up of coaches, sports directors, and commercial directors. They are called intermediate managers. The operating core are paid athletes and freelancers. There are 4 systems of influence in sport organization. The systems of personal control finds power in the strategic apex and coordinates throughout direct supervision. The system of specialized skills empowers the operating core, who coordinate through standardized qualifications. The system of bureaucratic control is based on results and work processes standardization. And finally, the system of ideological control situates power in the ideology analysis ideology analysts who coordinate by standardizing the norms. The final life cycle of the professional configuration is decentralization and greater autonomy for the base. Strategic analysis allows to create the power balance in sport, but it's often criticized because of its conflict and utilitarian view. Power is seen as an inevitable and natural manifestation of human action. However, critics do claim that it is hard to apply to nonprofits because volunteers give their free time willingly. The organizational system is criticized as determinist and macrosocial, and it runs the risk of misinterpreting reality by excessive modeling. Sociology of organizations as a whole is criticized as applicable but not usable. In other words, the field takes into account different situations, but it fails to provide tools and solutions for the day-to-day managerial or professional situations. So it's highlighting the gap between research and intervention. So to bridge this gap, some people are advocating for interventionist sociology. For example, clinical sociology, psychosociology, and social intervention. And these fields attempt to provoke autonomy in groups by self-management and conflict resolution by the actors of the group. And this intervention position advocates for continuous dialogue between the researcher and the actor to produce shared knowledge. So sports sociologists will analyze organizations by immersion. And sociological interventions are in its infancy as a field in the study of sport organizations or sociology of sport organizations, but it will allow actors to understand their day-to-day events in a more deep way, but it prioritizes practice over theory, and so it will only allow marginal generalization. So all of these theoretical approaches, strategic analysis, organizational system, and sociological intervention, just like when we talked about the theories, all of them have their pros and cons. So, in conclusion, although initially fragmented, studies on sport organizations have multiplied. And remember, this is the history of sociology of sport organizations in France. Sport organizations cannot avoid power struggles, and they change due to environmental pressures. And this is just the same that other social organizations. The sociology of sport organizations, like the sociology of organizations, faces theoretical, practical, and scientific criticism. And one of these criticisms is conceptualization, because there is no clear general theory of organizations underpinning all sectors and professional fields, such as the public, the private, the nonprofit, and the entrepreneurial sectors of organizations. The sociology of sport organizations field is in power right now, but it must not isolate itself from its connection to other disciplines to continue to grow strong. If you have any questions, now will be the time to express them. And if you think of questions later, you know where to find me. Go to claudiabiams.com.